I'm a cultural manager and a researcher at the Paris Center for Political and Sociological Research. What I'm going to present today, the title of my presentation is Resilient, Collaborative and Innovative Cultural Practices in Brazilian Borderlands, the example of the Fronteiras Culturais movement throughout the 2020 crisis. So what I'm going to present today comes in part from my PhD research that I concluded recently, which was on cultural networks in the Brazil-Uruguay and the France-Germany borderlands, and in part from the research that I continued conducting in the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands in the context of 2020, which was complicated in Brazil for different reasons. And so that's what I'm going to present today, talking specifically about a collective that I encountered when I was doing my fieldwork in the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands, which is called both Fronteiras Culturais and Fronteiras Culturales, the two names being the name in Portuguese and in Spanish, which are the two names which they use because the movement is situated in the borderlands of Brazil with its neighbors, who are mostly Spanish-speaking. So to start, just to situate the areas that I'm talking about, because for most of you, these might seem completely foreign. So on the map to the left, where the circle is, you can see the borderlands that I'm talking about, which are between Uruguay and Brazil. Brazil being a continental country, with our European references, it's huge. And so Uruguay is situated at the south of this continental country, Brazil, and to the west, Argentina, which is also a much bigger country than it is, than Uruguay. And so so present-day Uruguay being a region which has historically been in the position of a buffer zone between the empires, the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire, and then present-day Brazil and Argentina. And the border has been stabilized in its current position since the creation of Uruguay as an independent country. And so since 1828, it's been stabilized in this position. But we're talking about spaces which are hybrid. So we've talked a bit about this since this morning, because of historical reasons. So what I've just pointed out, and the fact that there have been lots of movements of population, and also for geographical and environmental reasons. So we're talking about the same biome, the same natural settings, which are called the Pampa, which are lowlands, in which the main economic activity is cattle breeding, and the cultural expressions in this region tend to be similar. And in the case of Brazil, they're quite different from what we can encounter more up north. So a more close-up vision of this border region, with the border and the border cities. You can see that there are many cities at the border in Uruguay. This is in part because the urbanization of the region is intimately linked to the presence of the border. So both countries placed cities or created cities along the border to stabilize it, both in terms of military, and also cities tend to set up along borderlines because, well, for reasons linked to trade. So this is the context, just so you know what kind of context we're talking about. And to show you visually, so these are two photos which were taken literally along the borderline. So I am standing on the borderline when I'm taking the photos, and we can see signs of the two countries in street signs. In the photo to the left, you can see a block of white stone. This marks the border, but we're talking about a dry border in the case of many of the cities. Some of them have a river between two. But we're talking about borders which are crossed daily by residents which live in the cities on both sides of the border. And we're talking also about very remote areas. So the state is present, but also many informal and an everyday relation to the region and to the border is established. For example, in the photo to the left, we can see that we have the license plates of the motorbikes. So the state is present. We can see that Uruguay or Brazil is written on the motorbikes, but they're all mixed up. We can also see in the photo to the right, which was taken on a bridge which connects Quaraí in Brazil to Artigas in Uruguay. And we are looking at customs, but we see to the right that a line has been attached to the bridge and they're close drying. So this is to explain that we're talking about regions in which, as the quote that I brought from a border scholar says, borders, boundaries, or border regions tend to be thought of as problems or as fixed lines, but they're better thought of in terms of neighborhoods. Another aspect that's important to think about, especially for us who tend to think about cross-border cooperation in the European context, we have in those spaces a cohabitation of formal processes and informal processes. Whereas in Europe, we would tend to have a predominance of formal processes in cross-border cooperation, and also a contribution of informal processes, which are always present and which are important. In the context that I'm bringing here, informal processes tend to be much more predominant. So I brought a photo to the left. You can see Mercosur Calçados, which is a shoe shop called Mercosur. This is for the joke, but to show that we could tend to think with a European lens that the Mercosur would be the main contributor to cross-border cooperation processes in this context. But actually, its contribution is minimal. In terms of culture, it has some contribution, but it's more symbolic than practical. So we are in contexts in which civil society makes the cooperation much. So just to present how I thought of these cultural actions in borderlands, and so what I call the cultural ecosystem in the borderlands. Very simply, that's the analytical pillars that I used, but they're very wide and very simple so that I could analyze both my cases. We have the pillar of the people, the cultural networks who are making these cultural actions in the borderlands. We have the practices, which are the cultural actions, both the formal cultural actions, more institutionalized ones, and the informal cultural actions, which contribute to the cultural ecosystems. And these cross over with the places where these actions take place, which I call the topography of culture. So the landscapes, the infrastructure, where these actions take place. So at the cross of these three pillars, we can analyze the cultural actions. So we have many cultural actions taking place in these borderlands between Brazil and Uruguay. Just to give three examples, we have, for example, in 2014, a cultural integration calendar which was set up to bring together in one place all the cultural actions, the festivals, the manifestations, the book fairs, etc., that were being produced in the borderlands so that they were centralized. There is a binational book fair, so to the image to the right, that takes place in Santana do Livramento and Rivera. And in the same city, we also have a binational festival of gastronomy and wine producing. And so we can see that in all these marketing documents, the border is very present. whereas even though we're talking about cross-border cooperation, the border is present, the line is present. We can also see visually the idea of cooperation, because we can see the passage. We can see the border mark in the image of the binational book fair. So we see the identity of the border, which is very strong. These actions are very grounded in the borderlands. And the border is very present even in the way people speak about their region. They call it la frontera or a frontera. They refer to themselves as borderlanders, and inhabitants from neighboring regions refer to them as such as well. So within this context, one of the movements wide-ranging and that acts as a sort of network of the networks, or collective of networks, is called Fronteiras Culturais or Fronteiras Culturais. And it aims to promote exchange, cooperation within what it calls the corridors of cooperation of Brazilian borderlands with the neighbors all being Spanish-speaking, except for Guyana, which is French-speaking, but actually there are a lot of dialects as well, and other languages which are present. So corridors of cooperation, as they call them, are promoted, and they are divided up in small units based on the biomes, so the natural resource, the natural characteristics of the different spaces, and characteristics which go with them. And so they aim to think Latin American cooperation from the border. And another distinctive characteristics being the thinking from the south. The image to the right says, our north is the south. Our north meaning the direction in which we look. So they aim to think from the south. Here I bring a few images of their work and of what they aim to do. So the idea of diversity is at the core of the work. The idea that Latin America isn't actually only Latin, and the idea of Latin America doesn't come from Latin America, it came from outside. So the aim is to also put forward the indigenous, the Afro roots of South America. And the spaces in which they act are spaces that tend to be overseen and that tend to be forgotten. And so they aim to bring forth these spaces that, because they are at the periphery of in the case of Brazil, a very big country, tend to be overlooked, but actually culturally have very interesting expressions to transmit. So this movement, in the context of March 2020, a meeting that was set to happen in Foz do Iguaçu at the triple border between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. Had a big meeting to create a portal that aimed to put forward the actions of the collective, and every day release some content produced by the different subgroups, the units I talked about. And unfortunately, in this context, so this was set up in March, the Brazilian government had changed in January, going to Jair Bolsonaro, so the far-right government that's actually in place, that's currently in place. And then came the pandemic. So this meeting wasn't, didn't take place. And right after this, the network, which is very articulated, so its strength is its ability to communicate very quickly and in a very articulated way, because people know each other, they work together. It's a grassroots movement. So very quickly they knew that artists and producers and researchers, which are a part of this collective and this network of networks were in a critical situation, that many of them had lost their livelihoods, that they needed to find a way of raising funds. And so they decided to set up a campaign, which they called Fronteiras Culturais, which aimed to reuse this idea of the platform, but in a very quick way to be able to respond to the situation, using a Facebook page, or their Facebook page, and doing lives about border-related issues, from so strictly cultural issues to education issues to historical conferences about the region. And also to give space and to give a platform to the members of the collective to promote courses and workshops so that they could raise funds for themselves or for others, in the case of members of the collective who didn't need the money. So they would raise funds and then donate part of them to members of the collective who needed it. And so between March and the end of May, it even went to September. These courses took place on the platform. In this presentation, I have the participation of a member of the collective, but who wasn't able to join live for reasons linked to internet connection. But I have a video of Carolina Caceres, who will talk a bit about her view of the situation locally and bring first-hand information. So I'll put on the video of her speaking here.
I am from the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands. Yes, I live at Santana do Livramento right now. That is on with joined the Fronteiras Culturais movement at the very beginning of 2020 because I was producing Lunares Binacional. That is a binational project that aims to develop gender equality in music at Santana do Livramento and Rivera borderlands by offering artistic and professional qualification to women that have no conditions to access musical studies. I was invited then by one of its creators, that is Ricardo Almeida, to join the cultural agenda, the cultural calendar of the collective, of the movement, both with the project Lunares and as an artist, in order to share my music work. Okay. I attended meetings with other participants from Santana and Rivera, and we started to organize the cultural calendar as well as the actions for the whole year.
And to talk a bit more about the context in 2020, did the election of Jair Bolsonaro have an effect in one way or another on your artistic practice in the borderlands?
Yes, completely, because Brazil was coming since 2016 in a way of conducing policies without of degradation of cultural policies, may I say. Yeah. So the election of Jair Bolsonaro just completed that kind of way of conducting politics, because we artists have the target, one of the targets of this government, and yes, completely. Bolsonaro encouraged artists to produce work with political content against the government and to engage against the government too, as well as the pandemic also affected, because in my case I'm a performer. I usually work a lot on events outdoors, right, and indoors. And so it affected me. I was completely affected because everything to stop all my activities and reinvent myself in a way to adapt to this virtual scenario that pandemic caused. Specifically about Jair Bolsonaro's election, I didn't see much engagement here at the borderlines. Most at the Uruguayan side, I would say, but at the Brazilian side, I didn't see that much. Yes, and I think largest cities could. There was more engagement, and a lot of artists were going to manifestations against the government, against the actions, and it was. I don't know. People were more engaged. It's because Santana do Livramento is still more conservative than other cities.
Okay, so that would be your explanation for the fact that the artists don't have such a critical posture in relation to the government.
In my perspective, apart from organizing cultural events, the Fronteiras Culturais movement has the aim of fighting for public policies, right? And since 2016, as I mentioned before, with President Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, right, Brazil had a huge loss on cultural policies, and the Ministry of Culture was dissolved, and then problems started, but not even in culture, but also in health and education, that Brazil has huge losses. So Fronteiras Culturais opposes opposed and resisted to those actions, those political actions. And the movement isn't linked to any political party and doesn't have many criteria of participating. So people should have initiatives for cultural integration between countries, the ability to generate employment and work and income through culture, and above all, the sense of these small groups located in borderline that amplifies these connections between the borderline regions. I think it's one of the distinctive characteristics of the Fronteiras Culturais movement.
Okay, so if I understand what you're saying, it both has a strong action from the ground up, so in terms of acting for cultural policy in the government, but also on the it has a very large base and it's very inclusive of many actors. Is that what you're saying?
The base is the what makes the resistance of the movement, you know. These connections between all the participants, right? That helps to, how can I say, strengthen the links between the borderline regions.
Okay.
And between people, artists, researchers, producers. Maybe what could make it stronger and in the future is that it could have a legal personality to give more support to people and to transmit that trust in the movement to all their collaborators. Yes. What I see here in Santana do Livramento and Ribeira is that people are good at getting together, but not necessarily taking the next step of collective articulation. We don't have the mentality of thinking as a collective yet.
So you've seen some contributions from Carolina, who knows the context from the inside, and who brought a few points to help me think about the strengths and weaknesses of the movement in the context of crisis in 2020. One of the main aspects of this movement, if I think about it in terms of the three pillars, so I'm bringing here the typology that I put together in my thesis, and where I situated the borderlands that I studied, is that the Fronteiras Culturais movement is very grounded into place. And very grounded into people. So if I talk about this typology and the three pillars, if we are thinking between the pillars of places and people, the predominance that we have is of vision, of activism. If we are talking about the link between, at the crossroads between people and practices, we have cultural networks. Which link people and practices. If we are at the crossroads between practices and places, we are thinking more in terms of territorial marketing. This logic might be more present in the EU. So we are within the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands. We're really in a dynamic of people and places. We've seen that, as Carolina has said, people are good at working together. They know each other, they're connected, and they're quick at working with each other. This has its strengths in times of crisis. Very connected to place. As I said, the theme of the border is very present. So this has both positive and negative aspects. The negative aspect is that the grounding is very strong into place, but it's difficult to transfer to a non-place, to this digital non-place. And because we're talking about peripheric areas, the digital know-how was quite low, so it was very difficult for them to create these workshops, and they had to give training to people so that they could give these courses online. The positive aspect of everything that happened in 2020 is that this movement, which was mainly known within the borderlands and didn't have much visibility outside of them, managed to get some visibility because it had to transfer online. So this was a positive aspect. And to make a parallel between what I'm presenting now and what Louise Bonnet said this morning, I think here we're typically talking about a movement which tackles these challenges of cultural democracy. We're talking about geographical in-between spaces, which are at the periphery of states. We're talking about marginalized populations. We're talking about hybrid artistic forms, and we're also talking about deeply participatory processes and ways of working. So we're completely in another logic, which has its weaknesses as well. But I presented this today so that I could give a example of resilient cultural practices which are put in place in a context which is quite different from the European context that we know, and that really functions from the ground up and tries to, through its networks, to have some cultural policy, and which and these spaces get less visibility in cultural management and in cultural policy literature. So here I was trying to bring forth another context and other voices. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Solène. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen so we can see each other better. Yeah. Thank you very much, and it was a really interesting insight into your thesis, and also thank you very much for sharing this insight into the actual cultural practices and the conversation you had with the artist. Maybe as a first question, how come that you were interested in this specific border? Like, do you have any personal relation to this kind of place?
Well, I was living in Brazil until the pandemic, which brought me back to my home country, and I had worked on some European cross-border cultural projects. So in the European context, so I came at it with my European vision. And when I started doing my thesis in Brazil, I tended to think about cross-border cultural projects in a more European way. But I saw that many cultural actions were being set up in Brazilian borderlands, but in a completely different way. So that's what made me want to look at these processes and think, okay, so how are they put in place in these different regions? Do we encounter the same processes as in Europe? We don't. What can we learn from what's being set up in the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands? And how do these different, so I call them cross-border cultural ecosystems, how are they constituted? What are the actors? What are the processes? And what can we learn from putting these two one next to the other? Mm-hmm. So that was the initial idea.
Mm-hmm. So what was really interesting for me was this importance of the actual border, because like, for me, it's kind of a contradiction between the stressing of diversity, so like that everything kind of is mixed up, but on the other side, like this line, this border is really important for the cultural practices. So yeah, is this a contradiction, or is this even like forcing the creativity? What do you think about this?
I don't know if I'm gonna answer your question. So if I didn't understand your question, you can you can take me back to what you meant. But I completely see a contradiction. But I think it's present in all the border regions, because I think border regions or borderlands, different concepts are used. They answer a paradox all the time, because a border is a limit, but a limit exists because it is crossed. So there's always this logic of boundary and of crossing the boundary. So when I was talking to the actors, this conflict would be present also in the action. So it's a convergence and a divergence that cohabits, and it manifests differently. For example, in the France-Germany borderlands that I also studied, someone from a cultural institution, from cultural administration, said to me, it doesn't make a difference whether two artists from Strasbourg and Kiel, which is the city in Germany that touches Strasbourg, or from Paris and Berlin collaborate. It's the same thing. So in her view, it didn't make much of this contact, didn't make much of a difference. But other cultural actors were completely stressed the importance of actually the cities that touch each other, and this was much more present actually in the Brazil-Uruguay borderlands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Also regarding like the informality, you mentioned that there's a really large difference between European practices and Latin American practices. Mm-hmm. So do you think that with the political changes in Brazil right now, the informal practices are even getting more important right now? And another question, is the cultural practices or are cultural practices enforced by the government in Uruguay, or do they have some similar problems with the government there? Because I'm not so familiar with the political system there.
Did you say, is it enforced? I didn't hear correctly.
Yeah, enforced.
Supported? Do you mean, is it supported? Or?
Yeah, like if the government in Uruguay is supporting the practices or not.
So to answer your question about informality, yes, in the context of Brazil, right now, informal processes are predominant, not just culturally, actually, in terms of response to COVID, in terms of health. There have been lots of initiatives in favelas, so in shanty towns, of collective organization to respond to the situation, to the health situation, because the state doesn't reach these spaces, and so people have to organize themselves collectively as groups. But also, well, especially in the cultural sector. So in Brazil, when Dilma Rousseff was impeached and her vice president took over, he tried to take away the Ministry of Culture. There was some collective action, and so the Ministry of Culture was maintained, but it was close. And then when Bolsonaro came to power in 2020, the Ministry of Culture was extinguished. So the support, the governmental support to cultural actions is very limited right now, and especially in very remote areas like the borderlands. So yes, they have to organize to find other ways of working, and this depends a lot on informality. There are still public instruments that support culture, but they're much more reduced than they were until 2016. Mm-hmm. And on the Uruguayan side, yes, there is a Ministry of Education and Culture. They work together, and there are actually right now the support to culture is stronger on the Uruguayan side of the border.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned like the digital opportunities during the pandemic. Do you think like digital spaces are kind of a chance to preserve those border area art practices?
I think they're a way of making them more visible. For example, right now, the movement, the collective, is taking part in the social forum. Yes, it's a platform. I think it's the same as for many collectives or movements. Digital spaces enable people to communicate in a way they couldn't communicate before, at the same time as they make the digital gap stronger. So these spaces are also spaces in which internet connections aren't necessarily very good. And so in this way, sometimes it can be a barrier, but actually I think it's once the barrier has been overcome by these trainings in digital know-how, and if they manage to get access to a good internet connection, it's actually a tool to reach a much wider audience.
Yes, and we've seen this with
the conference.
So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks again, and also for the discussion afterwards, Solène.
Thank you for your questions and for the organization of the conference.